Hello, everyone. My biological parents split up when I was 9. I'm male. And my parents got equal custody of me. I would stay with my mom for 5 days a week since she lived near my school, and my weekends were spent with my dad. Despite their divorce, my parents have always been kind and gentle to me. Although I was unhappy that my parents were not together, I also understood that they loved me regardless of their relationship with each other. A couple of years later, my dad met my stepmother, Gina. When my dad first introduced my stepmom to me, I was 11 years old. She seemed really nice to me, and my dad looked so happy that we met, hoping for us to get along. So she had twins, Emma and Emily, who were both 14 years old at that time and had basically only been raised by her since her father had been absent from the time of their birth. This is why the girls were quite immature for their age and would throw tantrums publicly if Gina and my dad didn't buy them what they wanted or if things wouldn't go their way. I was an introvert and completely opposite to them, so I would sit silently and watch them embarrass themselves. After a year of dating, they decided to get married when I was 12, and even my mom attended their wedding. I was so happy that I had a new member in our family who would also be there for me. I thought me and my stepmother were getting along until I think a few months after their honeymoon, she told me while we were alone one morning that she didn't really like me and that we just needed to pretend to like each other for my dad when he was around. She continued to tell me that whenever my dad was not there, I should not bother her since she hated seeing my face, which reminded her so much of my mom. My tiny heart broke hearing her cruel words. I did not expect her to say something like that. I genuinely liked her and thought that our relationship was going to be okay, but alas, she did not see me that way. The twins, of course, heard her say this, and they would later tease me about how I didn't have a dad and how my dad loved them more than me. I remember crying and telling Mom about this, who immediately called up my dad and gave him a hearing. My dad assured her that there was no way that stepmom would have said something like that to me and that I might have misheard her. The next weekend, when I came to meet my father, my stepmother seemed pissed. She didn't say a word in front of my dad, but as soon as he had left, she furiously whispered to me about how she was going to make sure that I would not have a dad left in my life if I ever told my mom anything about her. She also threatened me that she would divorce my dad and take away all his money, so if I didn't want to see my dad living on the streets, then I should keep my mouth shut. I was just 12 years old, and I was frightened for my dad, so I just nodded my head in agreement. From that day forward, Gina made it her personal mission to make my life hell in every way possible. And because I was a child, I thought I would have to take it with my mouth shut. Whenever it was just me and stepmother, she would say things to get to me, and I would just not say anything, hoping and praying that she would stop bullying me. She would talk about my height, my weight, and would say how ugly I was. I hoped my dad would notice, but he never did. In fact, he thought Gina and I had a good relationship and would force me to go shopping, eating with her and the kids. She would take my dad's car to pay for our meals, yet she would not let me eat anything in the restaurant. I was only ever allowed to have soup or dessert, but no main course. I would sit miserably watching them finish off the main course while crying quietly. I would then come back home hungry, and she would then force me to go to bed hungry. There have been so many nights when I would cry myself to sleep hungry and tired of her hate towards me. At that point, I was at my wit's end, scared, angry, and frustrated with both my stepmom and my dad. This is why I would dread visiting my dad during the weekends and whenever it was Friday evening. I would try to escape visiting my dad by coming up with excuses like stomachache so I could stay over with my mom. Of course, my parents started noticing this, and my dad would call and tell me about how sad he was for not getting to see me. My mom would urge me to tell her if something was wrong, but I would always keep my mouth shut, still scared of Gina's threats. When I was 14 years old, my dad decided to take his entire family and me on a trip to Greece. Initially, I did not want to go, but my mother told me that this was a good opportunity for me to travel and experience the world, so I begrudgingly decided to join them. As usual, Gina pretended to be all sweet and kind in front of my dad, hugging me and asking me about school as if she was genuinely interested in my life. One thing I started noticing was that she would subtly tease me in her sweet voice, which was insulting to me. But at the same time, it would not outrightly portray her as being mean. For example, whenever I talked about how I was playing basketball, she would make jokes about how I should be taller if I wanted to play that sport, even though I was quite tall for my age, and would then say how I should concentrate more on studies rather than sports if I ever wanted to be something in my life. The twins would then smirk and call me names like meathead, even though I had better grades than them. My dad would notice this but would choose to ignore it. Whenever I would voice out that what she said made me uncomfortable and hurt, my dad would insist that she was just teasing and that I should lighten up. Gina would nod her head and tell my dad how I had no sense of humor and that I should have fun just like she did. This continued to happen throughout the vacation, and one day, in a moment of anger when she and the twins were teasing me yet again about my weight, while I was trying to enjoy the pool, I decided to be vindictive. I told the twins straight to their faces about how they both had double chins, which was embarrassing, and I watched their faces fall. I then turned to look at Gina and told her that she should not be wearing a shrug over her bikini because I could still see her huge stomach protruding out, which made her look like a penguin. I watched Gina's face turn red in embarrassment, and she got up to run back to the hotel room. The twins started yelling at me for being sexist and saying how I was horrible to say this about them. Later, they told my dad, and he came to talk to me, clearly pissed. He asked if I had really talked to my stepmother and stepsisters that way, and when I nodded, he went on a rant about how he raised me better than this and how I should never talk to a woman about her weight. I argued back that they were talking about my weight, my looks, and my height, yet my dad forced me to apologize to Gina, who apparently had locked herself in the bathroom crying after what I had told her. She and the twins made a big show about accepting my apologies. When I returned back home, I, of course, told my mom about all of this, and she again talked with my dad, who was trying to blame me for everything. But my mother threatened that if Gina ever commented about my weight or looks, then she would call CPS on my father. This scared my father straight, and I don't know how, but Gina never said anything to me after that. Of course, she and the twins would blatantly ignore my presence whenever my dad wasn't around, but honestly, I was fine with that. During a time when I was 16 years old, my mom was away for a few days. I had to stay with my dad and Gina. Gina had been complaining to my dad for a few days about how she hated cooking for one more member. So my last night, I decided to take over cooking dinner since my mother had taught me to cook from a very young age, as she wanted me to be independent. When my stepmom heard that I was going to cook, she told me that she wanted to invite a few of her friends also. I cooked, set up the table, served dinner to everyone. Everyone seemed to love my food and even praised me. Later, my dad decided to clean the dishes, so I was free to go to my room. This is when I heard Gina and her friends talking very loudly outside my window while I was in my room. Her friends were telling her how lucky she was to have a nice husband and such a great house. When they mentioned how nice it was that I cooked for them that night, stepmom immediately went on a rant about how annoying I was and that she couldn't stand seeing my face. She told her friends how she couldn't wait until I was 18 so she wouldn't have to see me every weekend. When one of her friends mentioned again how nice I seemed, Gina told her that she had actually expected me to fail and was hoping that I would mess up cooking the dishes so she would have something to blame me for. This really shocked me because here I was trying to be polite to her even though I knew that she hated me, but she seemed to have already made up her mind and refused to budge. As time passed, this hate just kept growing. During college, when I went away, I would sometimes come to visit my dad on his insistence for a few days, but even then Gina would completely ignore me. She would knowingly schedule family activities with just dad and the twins, or her and the twins, so they would not be around much, while I would be stuck at home. Every time I would wake up late because it was my vacation time, for Christ's sake, she would yell at me and tell me how embarrassing I was. She would call me lazy and inconsiderate if I made any messes around the house, even though I would always clean it up. I knew for a fact I was always respectful to her because my dad would have my head if I wasn't. I was very polite towards her and treated them very lightly to make sure I did not say or do anything that would upset her. But it felt like it was not enough and that I was still doing something wrong. She also was inconsiderate about my privacy. She would loudly come into my room while I was sleeping and wake me up, or barge into my room without bothering to knock, which would make me extremely uncomfortable. She would randomly check my room and under my bed for God knows what. She would refuse to pick up dinner for me, but would do it for the family and would not invite me to come down for dinner. Regardless of this, I would just keep my mouth shut and my head down and try to spend time with Dad whenever I could. Now, coming on to the main incident. When I turned 21, my dad asked me to come visit him. He told me how he had some important news to share. It had been a while since I visited my dad, so I was a bit apprehensive, but my mother encouraged me to visit, saying that he had some good news for me. I agreed and booked my tickets. When I arrived, I was greeted warmly by my dad at the airport, and we drove back to his place. I asked my dad what it was that he wanted to talk to me about, but he assured me that he would reveal everything during the family dinner. When we arrived, I noticed that the twins were home also. It had been a while since I had seen them. Emma and Emily didn't even bother acknowledging my presence, and neither did I. The night during family dinner, my dad started saying how he was proud to have 3 wonderful children in his life. He spoke about how grateful he was to have such a loving family and how he wanted to share some exciting news. The atmosphere seemed positive, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. As my dad continued speaking, he looked at each of us with a smile, including Gina, who had been giving me icy glares all day. My dad continued to say how he had recently lost his friend to a heart attack, which had given him a harsh reality check and made him think about how lucky he was to have all of us. He had also spoken to a lawyer and made a will. Hearing the word will, I immediately watched Gina and the twins perk up in excitement. Dad continued to say how he had carefully thought about it and decided to leave the house to stepmom since she was his wife. Gina beamed in pride hearing that and kissed him on the cheek. My dad lived in a 5-bedroom house, so if Gina ever decided to sell the place, she could have a fortune. Dad then continued to say that he had decided to leave me his entire retirement account money and his car. Now, my dad's car was not an ordinary car. It was a vintage car that he had spent a lot of money and time on maintaining. The car held sentimental value for both of us, as he had often shared stories of his youth and adventures associated with it. I sat there, still processing the information, and realized that leaving the car to me was my dad's way of expressing his love. As my dad spoke about how proud he was for me to inherit the car, Gina's expression shifted from pride to discontent. She exchanged glances with the twins, who seemed equally displeased. It was evident that the prospect of me inheriting a substantial amount of money and a cherished vintage car fueled their resentment. Dad, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room, went on to say how he would leave the twins the joint bank account that he and Gina shared. Gina was a homemaker, so the money belonged to my dad entirely. He said that he wanted the money in that account to be equally divided between them. He told them how they would have money and this house to live in, so they had nothing to ever worry about in case if something happened to him. I was honestly fine with this arrangement, and it seemed fair to everyone also. However, the twins immediately expressed how they had expected more, and that my dad should leave them his retirement account also, since I did not need it anyway. When my dad asked them why they would think so, Gina started saying that I was a guy, so I should find my own way of living, while they were women and would need more money for financial stability. My dad reminded Gina that he had already provided her children with college funds, and now they would even get their house and bank account, so they had absolutely nothing to worry about. Gina kept insisting how I didn't deserve so much money, but my dad reiterated that his mind was made up. I was sitting quietly and listening while they continued to argue. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Gina burst out crying. We looked at her concerned, and my dad told her that this wasn't even something to cry about since he had fairly divided everything. Gina, between sobs, started saying how she had kept her mouth shut for all these years to protect the family, but that she could no longer take it anymore. The room fell into an awkward silence, and my dad and I exchanged puzzled glances. Despite the tension, he gently urged Gina to share whatever was burdening her. Amidst sobs, Gina began to say how a few years ago I had tried to force myself on her, but she had tried to hide it to protect me. I was taken aback, shocked by the unexpected accusation. Before I could even process what was happening, Gina began to elaborate on her false claims. She told my dad that after our vacation in Greece, where we had that argument over weight and height, I would always stare at her and try to come into her bedroom uninvited. I sat frozen in my chair as she continued to fabricate a story about how I would try to barge in every time she had a shower, or come too close to her face when we were alone. She told my dad how she dreaded having me over every weekend because of this, since she was afraid that I would do this with the twins too. I tried to defend myself, furiously denying the baseless accusations and yelling at her for having the audacity to even make up such claims. But Gina continued to cry like a victim. She spoke about how I started to grow older, I would make her more and more uncomfortable, and on one occasion when she and I were alone, I tried to force myself on her. My eyes widened in shock, and blood drained from her face after hearing such a huge accusation from her lips. My dad looked confused and concerned, and his eyes darted from me to Gina, clearly at a loss for words to say. Gina kept telling her story, saying she suffered in silence for years, afraid to speak up for the sake of the family. I yelled at Gina that she was a psycho, since there was no way that I had ever even looked at her inappropriately, let alone touched her. Gina yelled back that she was no longer going to keep her mouth shut, and that she needed to expose a monster like me. The twins started shouting at me furiously for putting their mother through all of this, and used words like rapist and molester. My head was spinning, and all of this felt like a bad dream. I couldn't even imagine how a pleasant evening had turned into wild accusations being thrown at me. I looked at my dad for support, but he kept quite clearly trying to process everything that Gina had said. He asked her if what she had spoken was true, and Gina nodded, saying she would never lie to him about his own son, and that as his wife, he should believe her. While I tried to defend myself, my dad asked her again about why she didn't speak about this earlier, and Gina told him how She was afraid no one would believe her since I was a minor who was trying to do inappropriate things with her. After all, she was the stepmother who had married my dad, so people would not take her word, so she had to bear all this silently to protect the family. I was crying at this point, begging my dad to not believe her. I had never imagined that Gina was vile enough to make up such atrocious things, even after what she had put me through all those years. Unfortunately, Gina's manipulation had taken its toll on my relationship with my dad, and he seemed torn between trusting me and believing the woman he had married. The twins, influenced by their mother's narrative, chimed in with support for Gina's false accusations and yelled at me to get out of their house. I yelled back that this was my dad's place and that they shouldn't believe what their mother was saying since it wasn't true. My dad was sitting quietly in the midst of chaos. He then looked up at me and told me that I needed to leave the house until this matter was resolved. It felt like a punch to the gut. Being rejected by my own father who was believing his second wife over me. Hurt, confused and betrayed, I packed my belongings and left the home I once thought was mine. I flew straight to be with my mother, who was shocked to see me at her doorstep. When I told her everything, she was beside herself with rage and was ready to go face up with stepmom. But I requested her to not do something like that since there was no guarantee about how psycho Gina was. If she could make up such crazy lies just to get me kicked out of my dad's house just because she was upset at what I was going to inherit, then she could make up a lot more to destroy my life. I couldn't take the risk of having her in my life any longer, and this is why I decided to cut off my dad permanently. Since he had chosen to believe her, he didn't deserve to have me in his life. Later I heard from my mom that my dad did call and tell her about how he was ashamed to have a son like me and that he wanted nothing to do with me. My mom tried to defend, but it fell on deaf ears. She also received a lot of flack from my dad's side of the family who believed Gina's story as well, and told my mother that she had raised a pervert. I can't even imagine how painful it must have been for my mother to have heard these words about her son. Clearly the damage was done and Gina had won. I wish I could write that my life started improving after cutting her off, but it didn't. Gina and the twins would continue to send me a barrage of text messages saying unspeakable things and threatening that I should stay away from my dad forever. It became so bad that I had to change my number just to escape them. Things didn't improve for me even after that, because after what Gina had put me through, I was scared of being near any woman. I was scared that I would be again falsely accused of something like this and lose my job and career. I was afraid to meet anyone or go out on dates. Throughout all of this, Mom has stood by me and believed me. I went through severe depressive and suicidal episodes, and my mom flew to live with me for a couple of months so I would be all right. Slowly, my mental health recovered and I started to live my life. Eventually, I met a wonderful woman named Marsha who brought the sunshine into my life. She has absolutely changed my life, and my mom adores her as well. Marsha and Mom are everything to me, and thanks to them, I continue to live my life with purpose. Just a week ago, I received a call from an unknown number. Thinking it might have been Amazon, I picked it up. To my shock, it was Dad. I was taken aback by hearing his voice, and the first thing he told me was how much he had missed me. It had been a long time, almost 7 years, since I had heard from him. He sounded old. I asked him about how he got my new number, since not a lot of family members had it, but my dad dodged the question and asked me if I was doing okay. I kept quiet and then told him not to bother me again since I had nothing to tell him. This is when my dad broke down and started to cry. He begged me to forgive him and kept saying how bad he was to have abandoned his own son. My curiosity piqued and I waited for him to explain himself. That is when my dad started to say how Gina had been cheating on him with his best friend for a few years, and after he confronted her with proof, she didn't even bother hiding any longer and said she was tired of being married to a pathetic man like him. Gina revealed to him that she had only married him for his money and that she hated being someone like him. When my dad kept pushing her for more truth, she finally admitted how she had made up all those accusations about me because she hated me as well and wanted all my dad's wealth for herself and her daughter because they deserved it. As you can imagine, my dad divorced her and she got nothing from the marriage since she had an affair, even though her lawyers tried to fight for alimony. My dad continued to say how he had been waiting to divorce Gina so he could officially get in touch with me and apologize for what he had put me through. He said how he wanted to catch up on lost time so we could have a better father-son relationship. At the mention of father and son, I couldn't help but scoff. I told him that he was no father of mine after how he quickly abandoned me for his wife's nasty accusations. I told him that I wanted nothing to do with him and didn't want him to bother me anymore. I cut the call and hoped that he would get the message. However, since then, I have been bombarded with calls from my dad and his side of the family, who I don't even talk with, about how my dad has suffered enough and I'm just making it harder on him. I feel conflicted with their messages. AITA for refusing to talk with dad after he cut me off for false accusations by Gina. Update 1. Okay, so my post was locked, but hopefully it's okay now. I have posted the link and tried my best with spacing. I'm on mobile. For all the support and advice, I really appreciate and am wholeheartedly so grateful to all who helped me to see how I was. Thank you. To explain a bit further, I am not just furious at my dad for believing my stepmother over me, but also for all those years she harassed me and did nothing to protect me. I was the child and she blackmailed and manipulated me while I would keep quiet. I have never told anyone about that. I think it's time I open up about this to my mom and let her know exactly what I went through, since I know she will understand. Update 2. Hi everyone. It's been a week since I updated for everyone concerned about my mental health. I'm doing okay. Thank you everyone for being so kind. Now, first things first. I booked tickets for my mom to come and visit me so I could tell her and Marsha everything. They already knew something was up with me. I started to tell them about how dad had contacted me after all these years, which shocked my mom. She asked me why he did so, and I told her. She had no idea that he had gone through a divorce and was furious at Gina for what she had put everyone through. Then I told both of them about how Gina would manipulate me when I was just 12 years old. I told them about how she would bully me while dad wasn't around and would threaten to divorce him if I ever decided to tell him. I didn't realize how traumatic these events were when I started to slowly open up about all these incidents that had happened to me one by one. By the time I was done recounting, I had tears streaming down my face. Marsha and my mom were crying quietly as well. My mom immediately got up to hug me and kept repeating how I should not have held this all in and that it was okay for me to share this. I cried for half an hour straight while my mom continued to hug me. Marsha also told me how no child should have gone through this and that it was completely fine if I chose to not speak to my dad ever again, since he should have done a better job protecting me. My mom nodded and told me that I didn't have any obligations to explain anything to my dad because when I needed him the most, he chose to believe his wife over me, and the only reason he was contacting me now was because he was lonely and had no family left. This is when I realized that they were indeed right. My dad perhaps never really loved me, because had he really loved me and known me, he would have never believed that I was capable enough to sexually assault someone. Since then, my mind has been made up after the conversation. After years, I feel so much lighter saying all my past with Gina out loud to my mom and Marsha. I have blocked my dad and will continue to block any other family member who decides to interject in my life. I owe no explanations to the ones who chose to abandon me. Update 3. Wow, I wrote this post 6 months ago and I can't believe how much my life has changed since. I want to start by sharing something happy. I proposed to Marsha and she said yes. My mom is happy for us and we're thinking about moving closer to her because the schools are better there. Both of us can work from anywhere, so it makes sense for our future family. I've also started therapy thanks to the advice of people on Reddit. It's helping me feel better step by step. I'm trying to focus on the good things in my life, like Marsha and my mom. They've been there for me, and I'm grateful for their support. The past has been tough, but I'm looking ahead to a brighter future, free from all the lies and family drama. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.